April 1945. The war in Europe is ending, but the air still smells of fire, oil, and defeat. Across a broken German airfield near Munich, U.S. infantrymen move cautiously through hangars pocked with bullet holes and blast craters. The battle is over, but the silence feels dangerous, like the pause before history exhales. Then one of the scouts spots it, a shape half buried in the mud. Twin engines, swept wings, glass canopy, shattered like ice. The soldiers stop and stare. It looks nothing like a Messerschmitt 109 or a Fuhler-Wolf 190. This isn't a prop plane at all. This is something else. They pull away the tarp, and the sunlight hits bare metal, smooth gray, unpainted. The tail reads Me 262. The first operational jet fighter in history. Inside the cockpit, the dials are scorched, but the layout feels alien. Instruments marked in km per hour that stretch past 900. The throttle is double-jointed. The pedals feather-light. Even damaged, it looks alive. The sergeant calls for an engineer. A crew chief from the 9th Air Force kneels beside the jet, runs his hand along the engine intake, and freezes. The metal isn't steel. It's nickel-chromium alloy. Lightweight, heat-resistant, the kind the Allies are still struggling to manufacture. He mutters, "They were flying tomorrow's war." For years, the Allies had heard rumors of a German jet, a fighter so fast that even the best P-51 Mustang couldn't catch it. Pilots called it the Ghost, appearing in high-altitude dives, vanishing before anyone could react. Most thought it was propaganda. Now it was real. Within hours, U.S. intelligence teams arrive. The wreck is carefully dismantled and loaded onto a truck. A major overseeing the operation radios headquarters. "We've got one. Intact. Engines." Repeat. "Both engines intact." He doesn't know it yet, but that single report will ignite a technological revolution. A race not for territory, but for time. Because inside that machine lies every secret the Germans had tried to hide. Axial compressors, swept wings, heat shielding, turbine metals, and jet ignition systems far ahead of anything the Allies possess. And as that Mi 262 is driven west under armed guard, one truth becomes clear. The war for Europe might be ending, but the war for the skies has just begun. Somewhere in California, a man named Clarence Kelly Johnson is about to receive the most important crate of his life, and with it, the blueprint that will end an empire. For 2 years, Allied pilots had whispered about it. The German plane that wasn't supposed to exist. It could appear out of the clouds, flash past at nearly 600 miles per hour, and disappear before anyone could fire back. They called it the Swallow, Dwalbe in German. Sleek, silver, and untouchable, the Messerschmitt Me 262 was more than just a fighter. It was Germany's last miracle, the weapon meant to reverse the war. Goering had promised it would sweep the Allied bombers from the sky. Pilots believed it could outrun bullets themselves, and in the beginning, it looked like they might be right. The Mi 262's twin Jumo 4 turbojets could propel it 125 miles per hour, faster than a P-51 Mustang. Its climb rate double that of any piston engine in the air. In test dives, it touched 540, even 560 miles, flirting with compressibility. The invisible barrier that shredded wings and locked controls. No Allied aircraft could keep pace. But the miracle came with a curse. The Jumo engines rushed into production with wartime alloys, lasted only about 10 hours before disintegrating. Each turbine blade was a chemical compromise, part steel, part ceramic, fragile under pressure. Pilots were told to throttle gently or risk melting their own engines mid-flight. One German ace later said, "The Me-262 was like a thoroughbred racehorse that broke its leg if you rode it too hard." Its design was revolutionary. Swept wings for speed, tricycle landing gear for control, nose-mounted cannons for precision. Yet for every E-2 that flew, 3 sat grounded, waiting for spare parts that never came. The jet that could have ruled the skies was being strangled by its own perfection. And still Allied intelligence feared it. A single Mi-262 squadron could scatter a formation of B-17s in minutes. The Luftwaffe's Jagdquarter 7 unit claimed dozens of bombers destroyed in its first few missions. American gunners would watch in disbelief as their .50 caliber rounds failed to catch the blur passing through their line of fire. The myth grew faster than the planes themselves. Newspapers back home called it Hitler's lightning. U.S. generals privately called it the nightmare. But myths are powerful only until numbers intervene. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had built 1,400 Me-262s, but only about 200 ever saw combat. Fuel shortages, pilot training gaps, and sabotage turned the invincible jet into a ghost fleet. The Allies bombed assembly plants daily, forcing Germany to hide their miracle weapons in forests and tunnels. And the irony was brutal. The Germans had built the future, but they no longer had the means to use it. So when that captured Me-262 arrived in Allied hands in April 1945, it wasn't a trophy. It was a time machine. Because in Burbank, California, a handful of engineers were already racing to do the same thing and failing. Their prototype, the Lockheed P-80, couldn't stabilize past 450 miles per hour. The engines overheated. The wings vibrated. The airflow tore the fuselage apart. Then a crate arrived from Europe, marked confidential Luftwaffe technical equipment. Inside were turbine schematics, alloy samples, and fragments of a captured engine labeled Jumo 004. Kelly Johnson read the report twice. Then he smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "the enemy just gave us the missing piece. The world's fastest arms race had just changed sides. Long before that German jet fell into Allied hands, America was already chasing a ghost. The concept of jet propulsion had been floating through laboratories since the late 1930s. A dream of flight without propellers, of thrust born from heat instead of motion. But by 1943, the dream had become desperation. Piston engines had reached their limit. The skies over Europe were thick with smoke and loss. At 25,000 feet, a Mustang could escort bombers, but barely. The Luftwaffe's fighters still climbed higher, dove faster, and fought with the cold efficiency of engineers who knew they were running out of time. In Washington, a small committee was formed inside the Army Air Forces. Its mission: catch up to Germany's rumored jet program at any cost. The memo read like a warning. Adversary aircraft may soon exceed 500 miles per hour. Existing designs will be obsolete within 12 months. That was when they called in Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson was 33 years old, sharp-tongued, famously impatient, and already responsible for some of the most advanced aircraft the Allies had. His Lockheed P-38 Lightning had changed the Pacific Air War. Twin engines, twin tails, and a personality to match his own. But the P-38 was still a piston machine. Johnson wanted something faster. Something that didn't care about gravity's old rules. When the Army gave him the assignment in 1943, he didn't celebrate. He just asked, "How much time do I have?" 6 months. Johnson nodded. "Then you'll get it in 5. The project was designated XP-80, later nicknamed Lulu Bell, a single-seat, single-engine jet that would use General Electric's first American turbine, the I-40, a crude copy of Britain's Whittle design. But the I-40 was unpredictable. It surged under pressure, stalled mid-flight, and melted at altitude. Engineers couldn't figure out why. The compressor stages were too narrow, the blade angles inefficient. Every fix created new failures. It was like chasing a phantom. Meanwhile, reconnaissance photos from Europe confirmed the nightmare. The Mi-262 was real and operational. It wasn't a prototype. It was fighting, flying, and winning. At Lockheed's Burbank plant, tension turned to obsession. The engineers lived in the hangar, sleeping under drafting tables, eating cold sandwiches over blueprints. Johnson forbade bureaucracy. No memos, no committees, no delays. He wanted results, not excuses. He told his team, "We're not fighting the Germans. We're fighting the calendar." What they didn't know was that on the other side of the Atlantic, the answer to every one of their problems, airflow, compression, heat balance, already existed, sealed inside the turbine of a German jet streaking across the Rhine. All the equations they couldn't solve had already been written in Munich. So when that Mi-2 arrived in crates at Wright Field months later, it wasn't just an artifact. It was a revelation. Kelly Johnson stood over the dismantled Jumo 004 engine, ran his fingers along the curved blades, and whispered, "So that's how they did it." For 2 years, America had been building the future blind. Now, they had eyes. Within 72 hours, the jet age in America would begin in earnest, born from the wreckage of the enemy's last hope. By late 1944, the sky over Europe had become a factory of death. Every day, Allied bombers roared across Germany in waves, thousands of engines, hundreds of contrails. But behind the numbers hid a terrifying equation. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outproduced, yet still terrifyingly efficient. The Mi-262 was Germany's last variable in that equation. A weapon designed not to win the war, but to delay its defeat. Allies had 12,000 fighters in the air. Germany had barely 1,400 Mi-262s produced, and only 200 ever made it to combat. But every one of those jets changed the calculus of survival. At 540 mpbr, the Mi-262 could make a firing pass through a bomber formation in just 7 seconds. A B-17 gunner had less than 2 seconds to spot, track, and fire before the jet vanished. In its first month of service, a single Mi-262 squadron shot down 45 bombers. Allied commanders called it aerial attrition mathematics at its worst. But those same numbers also showed Germany's unraveling. Each Mi-262 engine required 8 rare alloys Germany could no longer produce. Every jet consumed twice the fuel of a piston fighter at idle, while the Reich had less than 5% of its 1940 fuel reserves. The Mi-262's operational lifespan, less than 20 flight hours, before total failure. It was a masterpiece, chained to a dying economy. Meanwhile, the Americans had turned production into a weapon. While Germany crafted perfection by hand, the U.S. built speed by system. A single American plant in Englewood could turn out 25 P-51 Mustangs a day. Boeing's Seattle lines produced one B-17 every 63 minutes. The Luftwaffe couldn't fight that kind of arithmetic, but Hitler made it worse. Obsessed with offense, he ordered the Me-262 converted from interceptor to bomber, adding bomb racks that crippled its performance. Jet pilots called it a suicide decision. By the time Hitler reversed the order, it was too late. The Allies controlled the air. Germany's airfields were craters, its fuel depots burning. The Me-262s that did fly had no radar support, no escort, and often no replacement parts. Pilots risked taking off under strafing fire, sometimes with one engine already dying. Yet the numbers still haunted Allied command. Each Me-262 downed required 30 P-51 sorties to catch it during takeoff or landing. The only moments it was vulnerable. Even crippled, the jet represented the one thing Germany still had: fear. So when the first captured Me-262 was shipped across the Atlantic in 1945, it wasn't sent as a trophy. It was sent as an equation. The proof that the future of war would belong to whoever could build and sustain the math of speed. And in Burbank, California, Kelly Johnson was already holding the answer. The message from Washington was short, almost cold. Analyze, replicate, surpass. For the first time in the war, America had in its hands not just the enemy's machine, but its mind. The hunt for German technology began before the shooting stopped. Its code name was Operation Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. To the men who ran it, the goal was simple. Take everything, every plane, every drawing, every idea, as the Allied armies closed in on Germany from both sides. A new kind of unit followed in their wake. Not soldiers, but scientists, engineers, and test pilots. They were the T-forces, intelligence task groups tasked with finding the future before someone else did. In the spring of 1945, one of those teams reached a small airstrip outside Munich. The Luftwaffe had fled, leaving behind hangars full of wrecks and prototypes. But in one far corner of the field sat something different. And Me-262, only untouched by fire, its canopy cracked but intact, its engines gleaming under a film of dust. Colonel Harold Watson, commander of Operation Lusty's Watson's Whizzers, stepped out of a jeep and stared at it like an archaeologist finding a fossil from another world. "Get mechanics," he said quietly, "and fuel, lots of fuel." For 3 days, they worked around the clock under armed guard, patching the fuel lines, scavenging tires from wrecked trucks, and recharging the battery by hand. Then, in the early dawn of April 28, 1945, a U.S. pilot climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the unfamiliar throttle, and pressed the starter. The Jumo 004s coughed, spat smoke, and then screamed to life. The entire airfield stopped to watch. The roar was like nothing any piston engine could make. A steady, thunderous howl that didn't pulse, but surged. The Mi-262 rolled forward, lifted off the ground, and vanished into the clouds. The first captured German jet was airborne under American command. When it landed an hour later, Watson sent a telegram back to headquarters. Jet aircraft successfully recovered and flown. Recommend immediate transfer for study. Within days, the jet was dismantled, loaded into a C-54 transport, and flown across the Channel to England. Destination, Farnborough. British engineers tore into it with fascination, measuring every component, every angle of its swept wings. Reports flooded in. New type of axial compressor superior to Allied centrifugal design. Suggest full duplication, but the final stop was America. Wright Field, Ohio, the beating heart of U.S. aeronautical intelligence. And from there, a copy of every drawing, every photo, every calculation was quietly forwarded to Burbank, to Lockheed, to Kelly Johnson. The first day the crates arrived, Johnson ordered the doors sealed. No reporters, no brass, just engineers. When they opened the first engine, the room went silent. "Gentlemen," Johnson said, "we are not here to copy. We are here to learn." The Mi-262 had done what no Allied lab could prove, that jet flight wasn't a dream, but a discipline. Its axial compressor delivered constant airflow. Its thin swept wings reduced drag at high speed. Its internal layout showed how to balance weight, heat, and thrust in one flowing system. By nightfall, Johnson had already marked up the blueprints. Notes filled the margins, calculations in pencil, rough sketches of modifications, improvements. He didn't see a German machine. He saw the skeleton of something greater. A jet that could be mass-produced, battle-ready, and sustainable. Operation Lusty had given America the enemy's masterpiece. Kelly Johnson would turn it into a weapon of peace, the prototype of a new world. At Wright Field, the Mi-262 was treated less like a captured enemy plane and more like an alien artifact. Engineers from Lockheed, General Electric, and the Army Air Forces surrounded its dismantled fuselage, sketchpads in hand, faces glowing under the cold light of hangar lamps. On the table beside them lay the heart of the mystery, two Jumo 004 engines, their blades glinting like polished bone. To the untrained eye, they looked crude, hand-welded seams, mismatched alloys, rough castings. But to Kelly Johnson, they were a revelation. Every flaw told a story. Every imperfection hid a principle. The Germans had used axial compressors, multiple thin stages of spinning blades that pushed air straight through the engine instead of spinning it outward, like Allied centrifugal turbines. The design was harder to build, less durable, but infinitely more efficient. It was the missing link America had been groping for in the dark. "This is it," Johnson whispered, turning the compressor shaft with his hands. "This is how they broke drag." Within 24 hours, Lockheed's engineers began running new simulations, slide rules clattering, chalk dust flying across the drafting boards. The axial principle could make America's experimental jet, the P-80, up to 18% faster. But it wasn't just the speed. The Mi-262's airframe geometry, those gently swept wings, told another story. At high subsonic speeds, traditional straight wings created a wall of drag that slowed aircraft to near stall. The Germans had unknowingly built a partial cure. Wings angled backward by 18.5 degrees, allowing airflow to travel further before compression choked lift. It was elegant, instinctive, almost poetic. Johnson studied the blueprint for hours before grabbing a pencil and sketching a modification to the P-80's leading edge. "Few degrees," he said. "That's all it takes." He was right. When Lockheed's wind tunnel team tested the design weeks later, the results were staggering. Airflow separation dropped by nearly a third. Stability increased by half. A borrowed German idea, blended with American pragmatism, had just unlocked a new kind of flight. Meanwhile, General Electric engineers dissected the Jumo's metallurgy. The Germans, short on strategic metals, had created substitute alloys that could endure higher heat than Allied designs, not because they were superior, but because necessity had forced creativity. G's metallurgists learned more in a week of testing than 2 years of guesswork. In a report marked confidential, one colonel summarized it plainly. They were starving, but still flying faster than we are. Kelly Johnson didn't copy the Mi-262. He translated it. He took its essence, efficiency through simplicity, and rebuilt it in the American language of mass production. The P-80's J-33 engine became the embodiment of that translation. Axial compression reinterpreted through GE steel, balanced with Lockheed's aerodynamic finesse. By June 1945, Johnson's team had shaved 143 days off their original schedule. The prototype stood gleaming under the hangar lights. Its polished skin, unpainted, its nose pointed to a different kind of sky. As the war in Europe faded into silence, the Pacific burned on. Johnson knew what was coming. If we finish this in time, he told his team, we might end the next war before it begins. The blueprints of the Mi-262 were no longer German. They were American now, reborn in the furnace of curiosity, smoothed by precision, and destined to change the shape of history. Summer 1945. The desert air outside Burbank shimmered under the California sun. Inside an old circus tent at the edge of Lockheed's factory sat the future. A handful of engineers, a pile of scavenged equipment, and the half-assembled body of a jet that didn't officially exist. They called it the Skunk Works. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, but to Clarence Kelly Johnson, it was perfection. The Air Force bureaucracy couldn't touch it here. No memos, no delays, no politics, just raw innovation. Men building faster than regulations could catch them. The Mi-262's crates had arrived weeks earlier, marked confidential, do not open without clearance. Johnson didn't wait for clearance. He pried them open himself, laying the German blueprints next to Lockheed's own P-80 drawings. Where the Germans had used exotic alloys, he substituted standard American metals. Where they'd hand-forged parts, he designed jigs to mass-produce them. His motto was simple: build smarter, not smaller. The first thing they copied wasn't the engine or the airframe. It was the workflow. Johnson studied how the Germans had integrated mechanics, engineers, and test pilots into one feedback loop. He turned it into doctrine, a system of direct collaboration that would later define every secret program, from the U-2 to the SR-71. The P-80 took shape faster than anyone believed possible. The fuselage was a single, seamless skin of aluminum. No rivet heads to catch drag. The canopy curved flush with the nose, the wings slightly swept, a quiet nod to what Johnson had seen on the Mi-262, sliced through the air like a scalpel. He ordered the test bed engine installed. General Electric's J-33, built with newly learned German principles, but reinforced with American materials. It wasn't a copy. It was an evolution. Each night, the team ran the turbine until the hangar glowed orange with heat. Locals miles away said it sounded like a thunderstorm that wouldn't stop. On the evening of July 19th, Johnson gathered his exhausted crew. "Gentlemen," he said, "tomorrow we fly America's first production jet." The pilot was test ace Tony Levier. Dawn broke over the San Fernando Valley as he climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and pushed the throttle. The J-33 shrieked. the plane lurched forward, and before anyone could speak, it was airborne. The P-80 Lulu Bell left the ground smooth and steady, trailing nothing but a thin shimmer of heat. Johnson watched silently from the runway, arms crossed, a half smile beneath his cigarette. 6 minutes later, Leviere's voice came through the radio, calm and awed. "Kelly, this bird doesn't fly. She glides like a bullet." The first American jet had flown, and it hadn't just worked, it had won. The Me-262 was now obsolete. In one flight, the balance of air power shifted forever. The Luftwaffe's miracle weapon, once the terror of the skies, was reduced to a relic, a stepping stone that had built its own replacement. The world didn't know it yet, but in that makeshift tent in Burbank, the foundations of post-war aviation had been laid. The Skunk Works wasn't just a project anymore. It was a philosophy. From that day on, Johnson made a promise to his team, a rule that became legend. Be fast, be quiet, be on time, and if it doesn't work, fix it before anyone notices. America's next century of flight had just begun. Born not from privilege, but from stolen blueprints, sleepless nights, and the audacity to build the impossible in a circus tent. The war was ending. The jet age was taking off. Winter 1945. The war in Europe was over. But in the skies over the Pacific, it still raged with brutal clarity. Every flight was a race, not against time, but against death. Japan's airfields were being reduced to ash, but their pilots fought like ghosts, diving from clouds in suicidal bursts of fire. That's when the telegram arrived at Lockheed. Deploy one prototype jet to theater. Immediate evaluation under combat conditions. Kelly Johnson read it twice. He knew what it meant. The P-80, the Shooting Stars, was going to war before it even had a manual. The plane was crated, shipped to the front, and reassembled on a coral strip in Okinawa. Mechanics wiped oil off its polished wings. Staring in disbelief, they'd never seen anything like it. No propellers, no roar of pistons, just a smooth, predatory hum. The Japanese still fielded some of the fastest piston fighters in history. The K-84 Hayate and the J-2M Raiden both could dive past 400 meters. But this was different. The P-80 could pass 500. The first combat sortie was simple, a test flight with escort. But war doesn't care about tests. 15 minutes in, radar spotted bogies. Twin-engine Ki-45s, closing fast. The escorting P-51s turned to intercept, but the jet was already gone. The P-80's pilot, Lieutenant Russell Buzz Brown, slammed the throttle forward. The J-33 howled like a hurricane trapped in metal. The aircraft leapt from 300 to 450 meters in seconds, slicing through the humid air like a blade. He pulled up. Vertical climb. The Japanese planes tried to follow, but their engines gasped for air at 20,000 feet. Brown leveled off, turned inverted, and dropped straight back down through the formation. The sky flashed with tracer fire, but none found him. 2 bursts, 2 kills. The P-80 vanished into a dive, then leveled, its vapor trail a white streak across the dawn. The radio crackled with disbelief. "What the hell was that?" asked one Mustang pilot. Brown only laughed. Something new. By the time he landed, the field crews swarmed the plane. The engines hissed as they cooled, metal ticking in the tropical air. Brown stepped out, grinning through oil-streaked goggles. "She can run circles around anything with a propeller," he said. The report that followed was stamped top secret. It described not a plane, but a revolution. The P-80's speed and climb rate exceeded every operational fighter in the Pacific by over 25%. Maintenance hours were cut in half. The jet was stable, predictable, and fast. Terrifyingly fast. And here was the irony that no one missed. The technology born in Germany, refined in California, had just rewritten the rules of air combat over Asia. It was poetic, the final phase of the global war, ended by an airplane that embodied both sides of it. When Kelly Johnson received the after-action report back in Burbank, he didn't smile. He simply said, "Now we build the next one." That next one would become the Lockheed F-94, and then the F-104 Starfighter. Each generation faster, leaner, and more precise than the last. The jet duel that began over Okinawa wasn't just another mission. It was the symbolic passing of the torch, from the age of propellers and courage to the age of thrust and mathematics. And in that moment, one truth became clear to every engineer who'd ever held a wrench or a slide rule. Wars aren't won by machines. They are won by the men who refused to stop improving them. P-80 wasn't built to win a battle. It was built to make every battle after it impossible. The spring of 1946 arrived quietly. Across Europe, the smoke had lifted. The skies that once roared with the fury of engines now hummed with the sound of reconstruction. Civilian flights, cargo planes, mail routes. Yet in hangars and workshops across America, the silence meant something else. Evolution. The jet had arrived, and the propeller was dead. At Wright Field, engineers wheeled the old P-51 Mustang next to a P-80 Shooting Star. To the naked eye, they looked like cousins. The same swept fuselage, the same proud stance. But under the skin, they were from different worlds. The Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a masterpiece of pistons and pressure, looked ancient beside the sleek, tubular turbine of the P-80. The difference wasn't just speed. It was philosophy. One fought against the air. The other danced with it. Reports from test flights confirmed what no pilot could deny. At 30,000 feet, the Mustang began to struggle, its supercharger gasping in the thin air. The P-80, by contrast, accelerated. Its power wasn't mechanical. It was chemical, almost primal. A single throttle push sent it screaming forward, climbing 7,000 feet per minute. No vibration, no hesitation. The Mustang had ended the war. The P-80 had ended an era. Even the Luftwaffe's captured aces, brought stateside as consultants under Operation Paperclip, admitted defeat. One German test pilot, once a Me-262 instructor, reportedly stared at the Shooting Star's cockpit for a full minute before saying, "We would have built this too if we had time." That was the American advantage. Time, resources, and a refusal to stop. Where Germany engineered miracles in desperation, America engineered momentum. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works grew from a secret tent into an empire. Within a year, his team began work on the XF-90, the F-94, and the first swept-wing prototypes that would define the Korean War and beyond. The lessons from that captured me, 262. Its airflow, its metallurgy, its pain lived on in every drawing they made. For the pilots, the change was spiritual. The sound of a jet engine wasn't a roar. It was a whisper that built into a scream, pure and elemental. It didn't shake the cockpit, it pulled it. And once you flew one, you couldn't go back. Old veterans of the air war said it best. Propellers were courage, jets were destiny. The Air Force agreed. By 1947, piston engine fighters were phased out of frontline service. The Mustang became a relic, its glory frozen in the grainy film reels of black and white newsreels. The new world belonged to thrust, to burn, to the endless sky. But buried in that transformation was a final irony. The jet that had changed everything, that had ended the air war, was born from the wreckage of the enemy. And that perhaps was the truest victory. Not destruction, but transformation. The ability to take the weapons of tyranny and turn them into tools of progress. From the mud of Germany to the sun-bleached runways of California, one machine bridged the gap between past and future. The P-80 wasn't just America's first jet. It was proof that war, for all its horror, can sometimes ignite the very spark that ensures peace. At 600 miles per hour, peace had a new sound, a deep rising note that spoke not of fear, but of possibility. By the dawn of the 1950s, the names had changed. Shooting Star, Starfire, Sabre. But their DNA still carried the same ghost. The Mi-262 that fell into American hands in a muddy field, and the man who refused to let it stay an enemy's secret. Kelly Johnson's team didn't just build jets, they built the future. Their workshop evolved into the most secretive engineering division in the world, Lockheed Skunk Works. From that humble tent came legends. The U-2 that saw the invisible, the SR-71 that outran missiles, the F-17 that bent radar itself. Every one of them traced its lineage to that moment of curiosity in 1945, when an engineer turned a captured German engine in his hands and whispered, "This is how they broke drag." The P-80 became more than an aircraft. It was a pivot point. In just 2 years, it shattered the record books, training the first generation of jet pilots who would later dominate Korea and define modern air combat. America hadn't just caught up with Germany's technology, it had surpassed it. By 1953, the U.S. Air Force could claim what no other nation could: air supremacy, backed not by numbers, but by engineering velocity. Every time a P-80 roared across the Pacific, every time a Thunderjet climbed over the Alps, they carried an unspoken truth. War may begin with destruction, but victory belongs to those who learn fastest. The engineers called it progress. The pilots called it salvation. And at the heart of it all stood a paradox. That the path to peace had been paved with stolen blueprints, sleepless nights, and the courage to test what no manual approved. The Mi-262 had once been Hitler's miracle. It ended as America's blueprint. The P-80, born from that captured metal, proved that victory isn't just about who fights hardest. It's about who adapts fastest. When jet trails first painted the skies of post-war Europe, old veterans looked up and said the same thing again and again. That's the sound of a world that will never go backward. From that moment on, the sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory. And every plane that has since broken the sound barrier, touched the edge of space, or returned from it, owes a quiet debt to that muddy airfield in Germany, and the men who dared to see not the enemy's weapon, but humanity's next step forward. Because in the end, history doesn't remember who laughed first. It remembers who flew.